Good afternoon and welcome to the Duluth Public Schools February Committee of the Whole meeting. We'll start our meeting out with our roll call.
Member Banks.
Here.
Chair Eater.
Present.
Member Loeffler-Kemp. Here. Member Lothal.
Here.
I am here. Member Sadowski.
Here.
Member Williams.
Here.
Superintendent Magus.
Present.
Assistant Superintendent Bonds. Present. Deputy Clerk Simone Zunich.
Present.
Executive Assistant Shannon Brown. Here. Student Rep Taylor. Here. And Student Rep Dean.
Great. And so while we've done our roll call, we'll turn the rest of the meeting over to Assistant Superintendent Bonds.
Thank you, Chair Eater. Today we have two presentations, a primary presentation, and then, of course, our Executive Director, Simone Zunich, has a budget update as well. So our first presentation will be given by Todd McGowan. He is our Coordinator for Mental Health, Social Emotional Behavioral Learning, MTSS. So he has a very long title. So this is under the category of supporting every student, and I'm going to turn it over to Todd, who's going to introduce our guest.
Is that right?
Yep.
All right. So my name is Todd McGowan. I'm the MTSS SEB coordinator for the Duluth School District. So I was working with Jacob Laurent and Callie DeVries over the last 3 years under the AWARE grant. And then once Jake and Callie had left for other positions, I now fill kind of both of those positions currently. Still under the AWARE grant, which will run for another, the rest of this school year and then next year. And then I'll let you introduce yourself.
I'm John Herman, a school psychologist in the district of Duluth Public Schools. I've served multiple school sites across the district, but this year I've taken on a content lead position as an additional assignment, working with Todd on implementation of positive behavior intervention supports throughout the district.
So for today, what we'd like to do is just a brief overview of PBIS and what MTSS are and what that means for the district. And then we'll spend most of our time is just diving into outcomes. So as I said, we were funded through the AWARE grant for the last 3 years. We're in the 4th year of this cycle of the AWARE grant. And we'd like to just, inform you on all the things that we have accomplished. So go ahead. So for this school year, our action and our action card and our goal setting is just to focus on the implementation of PBIS at a tier 1 level, moving into tier 2, which is more specific supports for students, and then continuing to flush out our MTSS process and what behavioral support students have in each of our buildings. The action items that we've focused on are attendance, making sure that social emotional learning is achievable and attainable across the district, and then assuring that PBIS is implemented with fidelity at each of our buildings. So what is an overview of PBIS? And just by a show of hands, how many of you, have heard of PBIS or know what PBIS is? Do we need to spend a lot of time on that? Do you have any questions about PBIS specifically? So we won't spend a lot of time on PBIS then and just the introduction. But what I do want to emphasize is that PBIS, is not a curriculum or one-day thing that we do. It's not sit and get. It's not a prescription for our schools. It's being responsive and culturally responsive to what each school needs. This is the first time for me, and this is probably a bold statement, but where we have a good temperature of what each of our schools has done through a positive behavioral and intervention lens, as well as through that PBIS lens. And we'll get to that data here in a little bit, but that took a lot of work, for us to do the climate survey through a district lens, to have 13 of our schools PBIS certified at a tier 1 level, and then to be monitoring that implementation continually over the course of the year. So we're super proud of what we've done, and we'll start to get into what that looks like.
Member Derek Eater. Oh, sorry. Just want to make sure.
What? So one of the biggest accomplishments that we've done is in PBIS, there's something called the Tier 1 Fidelity Inventory that will measure the state of our teams and how responsive we are to the needs of each school. In the start of 2023, not only did the school district, the Duluth School District, take that Tier 1 fidelity inventory, but we overlapped it with a culturally responsive field guide, which is what you're seeing here. So now we are looking at the fidelity of implementation of each of our teams, our PBIS teams and our MTSS teams in each building, but we're also making sure that those interventions and what we're populating those frameworks with are culturally responsive and representative for the community that we're trying to develop those programs. What's super cool about that, super cool, is that the Minnesota PBIS is actually interested in what we're doing. So we're one of the first districts in the state to do that. So we're, in a sense, leading the way, and people want to come and look at how this is being implemented and the results that we're getting.
Member Lawford Kemp.
I just don't want to interrupt your
please.
presentation, but on the first page, you talk about fidelity at building levels, and then you've used that phrase a lot, and just, I think it might be helpful for common language for everybody here to kind of understand when you talk about we're implementing at fidelity, just kind of what you mean by that.
Go for it. Yep.
So a tiered framework for PBIS has certain features for it in order to be considered implemented correctly or fully. And on the TFI, or the Tier Fidelity Inventory, it lists what those metrics are, and then to the level of quality that they're being implemented. And it does break down specifically to individual sections in implementation, teaming, data use, and we monitor that at least 3 times, if not 2 times a year.
Member Ranks.
Thank you. So you're on page 5, and so I always ask questions about equity. Can you explain data for equity? What does that look like? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So for equity data, we often look at whether there is disparities in implementation and where those may be, and also outcomes. So when we look at data, we look at the valued outcome measures, whether that's academics, behaviors, suspension rates, school climate. We look at those metrics, and then we determine whether there's any disparities in people's experiences or outcomes, and then we design an action step towards improvement in those areas.
The other thing is how we interpret the data. So we are in our 3rd year of completing what's called the climate survey, where we're looking at the quality of the experience for families, staff, and for students. This will be the first year that we've been able to break that down as far as race, gender, what are our other components? Race, gender.
School, you could break it down by grade levels. There's a lot of demographic data that could be broken down that are on the survey.
So when we're able to have those conversations about equity, we have real-time data in what that looks like.
Member
Does that answer your
Lawford.
He can jump in.
Just on,
I'll always
Superintendent
yield to the
Magus.
superintendent.
on that note, just thinking of other ways that PBIS uses data for equity, because I think it's very important when we're looking at disparities. A lot of times we try to make sure that there is commonality between schools as far as what is a consequence. For instance, if a consequence is given at one middle school, it should be very similar at another middle school. Same with the elementaries. Also, sometimes when we're looking at different types of behavior, some behavior is considered more subjective as far as what the consequence will be, like disrespect, for instance. The range of what could be considered disrespect is pretty vague in some ways, and so we try and we try and make sure that there aren't instances of bias and things like that that creep in when it comes to defining something as being disrespectful or doling out a consequence for that. So those are different ways that I've seen data used for equity purpose, just a few. And then sometimes also looking at what are the antecedents, what happened before, maybe somebody did get mad and slam the door and swear at the teacher, but what happened prior to that, and was there means for a better relationship outcome than what happened. So really taking a look at root causes of behavioral situations and going deeper with what are the outcomes, and then also if there are consequences, especially negative consequences like suspension or things like that, how are we making sure that we are monitoring that for fairness based on gender, based on race, based on socioeconomic difference, based on special education. It's very, very important. And I think, not to get on a soapbox over this, but I think right now we're in a time where the word equity is being challenged nationally. And I want to say, as we've said in our newsletters, that equity is a key component of what we do here in Duluth Public Schools. Advancing equity will continue to be part of our strategic roadmap. And when we work on things like behavior and positive behavior interventions and supports, we have to have equity as a cornerstone to that work.
And the one other piece that I would add, is that okay if I talk, is also just looking at teaming structures within the building. Who has voice, like how are those voices amplified? What's the makeup of our teaming structures, as far as from an equity lens, and really making sure that we're inclusive in how decisions are made, not just why they're made.
So just a couple things off of Superintendent's last remark about the use of equity and how that's always going to be a part of it. Well, Duluth isn't going to stand alone there, because really PBIS 1 is in the Minnesota's in the forefront of PBIS. Denfeld, I think, was one of the first schools in the state to implement it, and it was well into like 2011, 2012 somewhere, or even maybe it was 2008, and then we took a little break when we combined Central and Denfeld for that year of renovation, and then we had a hard time kind of getting it back in there. And then I can remember Principal Tuskin's comment last spring that he was so proud. One of the things he was so sure that we were moving in the right direction is that every school in Duluth Public Schools was a PBIS school, which then leads me, and then in the nation, PBIS is in 49 states across the country, and it is, a big part of most primary and secondary educations, which really leads me to this kind of thing that I was just kind of looking at, because I know Duluth is recognized as a leader in PBIS. And then I went to the Department of Education, and they have this news release in August of 2024, and they list all these wonderful schools, and Duluth's not on there. And then it even goes to, goes the metro, but then it also says like, it's broken down into northern schools, and then say 3 districts recognized for sustaining exemplary district, and like, we're like a leader. So was that a mistake?
Would you want us to be listed there?
Yeah.
Because the application is open until April, and we can fill it out and be an exemplar district based on our numbers right now.
Well, that would be a good, maybe, I don't know. I was kind of surprised because they list so
something
many
that's an
schools, and
overlook, yeah.
we could be exemplary, or I just want to be listed as somebody that supports PBIS, or,
I can comment on that if that's okay. Because
Yeah.
historically, as a district, we've had different schools kind of
Yes,
grassroots implementing. And then it's just been in the recent few years, have we as a district decided to be a district-wide PBIS district. And every school has had some cohort level of training at different periods, and some of them has sustained it since then. I think the issue is no one
understand.
really knows
Yeah.
about filling out the exemplar
yeah.
applications and recognizing your school for doing the hard work that they're doing. But I just talked to Todd about that because we looked at our data this year, and it's like, well, we meet that mark for the district, and a lot of schools meet the mark for the school, and we could fill those out continuously and be on that list.
And that, you're spot on, and I apologize for just, because I do remember Denfeld and Lincoln Park, I mean, some of our early onboarding schools, were listed probably a couple of years ago. Other presentations we've had on PBS, I think we've been there. But I get it, and I get that there's a good side to being on this list, and there's also some concern about, we don't want other buildings that aren't quite there yet to feel, that somebody, I want everyone to be a first place ribbon winner. That's my downfall, is everybody gets an award when they're on my speech team, but.
I think the other side to that too is just the continual invitation for Minnesota PBIS to come and work with us. You know, and I think that there's an open invitation where they see the value in what we're doing, specifically regarding how we're using the climate survey, that we have those samples from each of our schools, that those are driving equity and driving intervention, and then taking that opportunity to apply for that exemplar status, but.
I'll call on Superintendent Magus, and then I just want to remind the board, there's several other slides, and I know they're going to go deep into some of the things that you are asking questions about. So I'll turn to John, and if we could allow a couple more slides, and then we're taking questions.
Thanks.
Superintendent Magus.
And when we give praise, it's not to say that we've finished our work, it's that we're on the right journey, we're on the right path. So by having all of our schools be positive behavior intervention and support schools, we have now a common universal system for behavior where we're looking at it much more deeply, and we're really thinking about it from a multi-tiered systems of support model. So that's why it's listed as a Minnesota MTS, Minnesota tiered model for implementation. So it's now MNTMSS, which the acronyms get, I think it's interesting, but we actually just received an email an hour ago from the state asking us to consider presenting at the Summer Institute about our MTSS implementation and the structures that we have, because they're seeing us as still having work to do, but also that we are doing the right work, and we're putting structures in place that are going to pay off. We've started the journey, and we have the implements we need to make that journey successful. And so I want to say thank you to the team, and we will consider that possibility for presenting. But again, there's more work to be done and more slides to cover.
So why we do the work, and two of the components of a PBIS and MTSS model are that we are research informed and data driven. And when we use those two skills or those two tools, we can increase social and self-awareness and decision-making, improved academic outcomes, increased student engagement, fewer special education referrals, and then hopefully fewer disciplinary actions, which we'll show you here in a little bit. But we're capturing that information and using that data to make informed decisions on how we respond to some of the issues that we have in our schools. You can go forward. One of the pieces and the components that the Minnesota Department of Education is pushing out right now is a comprehensive school mental health system, which includes PBIS and MTSS. That it's not only these two tools that we have in our toolbox, but we have a continuum of services and responsive interventions. You can keep going. We can go through this. So positive behavioral interventions and supports is one of them, and you can keep going again. We'll fast forward a little bit. But we want to be thinking at it from this 50,000-foot lens too, right? It's not just about boots on the ground, but how all of these systems are working together. And that means that through those models, through those tiered systems, we focus on mental health referral pathways. We ensure that there's co-located on-site therapy providers as well as district certified mental health, that we have a crisis response protocol, that we're using assessments like the SHAPE assessment. There's what is other assessment that we use? Do you know any? I apologize. There's another assessment that we would also use to just look at how our systems are running in a district and then in the school. That we are monitoring our data, and that we ensure that evidence-based interventions are being used in each of our schools.
Actually, can we go back to slide 8? Here's why. I want to make sure that we don't miss the opportunity to really reinforce what PBIS really stands for. And it's really about how we foster positive learning environments in our schools. And yes, it means looking at data. And yes, it means how we address discipline in schools, but it is really focused on what are the things that we are doing in all of our classrooms, in the hallways to reinforce positive skills and supports for students. So can you just spend just a moment on that piece of the PBIS framework?
Do you want to go?
So as far as the tiered model goes, a lot of what we're talking about is the core pieces of PBIS in the classroom, whether that's established expectations, clear routines, reinforcement for desired behavior outcomes or behaviors we're teaching within the school system. But there's also the need for more targeted support, more individualized support. A lot of what our work this year has been mainly establishing that core foundation, so that school-wide practice of, having consistent expectations, teaching and reinforcing those outcomes with the students and the staff and the families that are all part of it. So does that answer the question?
It does, and you want to maybe share one of the acronyms in the schools, whether it's ROAR or
SOAR.
PRIDE. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
pause.
Because
The three
that's
Ds.
probably where board members may have seen those signs in the hallways, and
Yep.
it's the outcome of our PBS work and make sure kids know what the expectations are as they're walking down the hall or how they're interacting with each other. And so you want to just share one, if you have one in mind,
I think-
not to put you on the spot.
No, but the other, just the other component too is not just to be working at it from a teaming structure, but that we're actually going into the buildings and measuring, where we're doing interviews with students, where we're interviewing staff, that we're looking at fidelity from that lens, where there's a high level of buy-in and understanding of what we're trying to accomplish through those acronyms. Sometimes we get lost in the weeds a little bit on, it's just giving kids rewards for behavior, but it's really about teaching appropriate behavior, about teaching, the skills that are required to self-regulate or to enter into community, and then making sure that we're catching kids when they're doing something good, which is super important.
Thank you. Yeah, the intentional teaching of those expectations.
Correct.
So thank you. I'll stop now, so you can go ahead. I'm sorry. You're good. Thank you.
You can go ahead a little bit. You can go one more. So we'll get into just what are the outcomes.
Slides there.
So for the Duluth School District, we have been charting, and that we've been keep track of our OSS data, so our out-of-school suspension rates. So in 2021-22, we had the highest suspension rates that we've had in multiple years at 2,194, which is also the first year that we started to implement PBIS and MTSS from that district lens. Since then, we've steadily seen our OSS data reduce to 1,272 in the 2022-23 school year, 892 in the 23-24 school year, and currently, so year to date for the 24-25 school year, we're at 436. So we've seen steady reduction over the last few years, not only in our suspension rates, but how we're starting to manage the acquisition of skills required to maintain, right, a presence in school. And you can go forward. Go ahead. Yep, sorry. It did make it. Yep.
Okay. So on the TFI, there is a overall implementation score. And for the past few years, you can see how we've been monitoring the scores across the district. 70% is the goal to fidelity according to the recommendations of the PBS assessment. But as you can see, we've had ups and downs, but we've become more stable in the past spring and fall this year to full implementation across the district.
The one nuance that I just want to point out about this slide is that in the fall of 2023 was the first year that we implemented the culturally responsive field guide when we were looking at our PBIS implementation. So it's the first time that we assessed culture with implementation of the PBIS tiered fidelity inventory. So that is the result of why we took a step back. And then once again, we've been able to maintain over the last year. Go ahead.
Can you explain that graph again?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah.
So
Well, the percentage tells you how many of the scores on the TFI were at 100% or partial or 0. So it comes to an average score of 70% or higher, then that's fully implemented, or if it's below, it's below fidelity, or it's not implemented fully. Hopefully that answers it.
Yeah.
Yep, all schools in the district took the survey and filled out this assessment. So this is an average across the district.
Member Sadowski?
Can you kind of expand on what you mean by assessing culture, or whatever you said about in the fall of '23? And that was when you started to implement some sort of cultural piece. Could you explain that a little bit more? to
Yeah,
us and what that
so-
entailed?
So one of the pieces, and I can share these with you, if you'd like to take a look at them, but one of the components of PBIS is that tiered fidelity inventory, and then we have the culturally responsive field guide. So the culturally responsive field guide will ask specific questions at each of those tiered areas about culture and if we're being culturally responsive in each of our buildings. And there's a wide range of things that it looks like, but it makes our teams talk about culture and whether or not we are being culturally responsive.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I would be happy to share that with anybody that if you're interested. Share the actual TFI. So we were able to take the TFI and then the culturally responsive field guide, put them into one document, and then we were able to create that as a district.
Yeah, the field guide offers a different interpretation on, and some of the examples that it has you describe as far as what your tiers in PBIS look like. So as, for an example, I'll give you one example. When they talk about listening expectations in the survey, how responsive is it to other languages, other cultures that you may have in your school? So when doing the field guide, they found, well, all of the signage and all of the explanation is monolingual in English. So, but we have other languages in the district, we have a language in the school, so translating that and then providing it another level of access for others to understand was one way the field guide helps in that regard.
Can we go back to? No, is that okay now? Can we go back to page 11? Quick question for you. And if you don't have this information, you could email it or whatever. What is the overall or actual out-of-school percentage? What's the overall? Is it 3%? Or do you know what that number is?
So I don't have those numbers, I don't have it broken down that far, but we could find out.
Okay,
Yep.
all right.
I think for the board and the public too, you'll note that there's no year for 2021. And that was during COVID. And then the year afterwards, that's when we saw throughout the country and here as well, a huge spike in behavioral issues as students returned to school.
If you want to stay, you want to talk about the climate survey real quick?
Can I ask a question quick?
Yes, Chair Derek Eater.
Sorry, just one question on, that slide right here. So I see that you've got the survey period, elementary, secondary staff, families, and those percentages. Are those percentages talking about the tiered fidelity inventory, or what are those percentages?
So this is the school climate survey. This is the survey that we've been sending out to staff, families, and students for the past few years. It's basically questions around perceptions of what their experience has been like in school, whether it's related to how they interact with each other, how staff interact with them, or how, safe they feel in the school. There's some safety questions there as well. But this is just really the overview overall score from those climate surveys. And then there's actually a norm comparison, which when they created this survey, they actually had a large sample of other schools and districts that took this survey, and this is kind of where their average is. And so you're able to compare, kind of like, where does Duluth Public sit with other schools that have taken the survey?
So for example, in the fall 2024 period, families said that they were 83.8%, and you compare that to the norm, is being above good and below, like, good, or like, what are the parameters?
Oh, sorry. The average score out of thousands of other schools that took the survey from families was a 79.2%, approval, basically. So they indicated a positive mark on the survey, averaged out to 79%. Families in Duluth in the fall, and that year was 83%.
Thank you so much.
So the way that we're using this information is to help drive the school improvement plans for each site so that goals are written based on what the staff, student, and families are experiencing in each of our schools.
And as you click on to the next slide, so remember we used to talk about this thing about desired daily experiences, right, of our students, just wondering how students feel about their school experience, how families feel about their experiences with our school. So their desired daily experiences, this survey is what we use as a way of gauging that. And this is our ongoing metric to find out if families are feeling better about certain aspects of the school's climate, and it's called the climate survey is that battery. So we're using it as a way of saying, are things improving? Do students feel like they are connected to the school in a more meaningful way? Do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like they are seen? So there's a lot of questions on this assessment, and we use that assessment again to have a baseline and make annual improvements. So it's all about that continuous improvement of the learning environment.
Correct. And the way that we're using them right now is as we get better, we're going from bookends from start of the year, end of the year, but also then comparing between fall and fall, spring and spring, and then establishing what those baselines are and then what action steps we want to establish. So the last section here in regards to how we're looking at data. So the district has taken the initiative to implement something called EduClimber, which is our data warehouse where we're tracking information. So we just did an EduClimber champions training where somebody in the building now can coach with the staff up on that. And using that data warehouse so that our information is more current, more data or more readily available, and we can start to create these snapshots of where our district is at. One of the things that we're working on right now is just this data calibration, because what we're finding is that all data isn't equal and that there's a lot of errors in what that looks like. This is just an example of what we're doing to flush out that data calibration. So as of 1/6/2025, we had 3,903 majors which were identified in EduClimber when we pulled that information. So if you would keep going. So we are able to identify what our major behaviors are. We know that there are disruptions or disorderly conducts. We know that there are attendance issues. And then we also know that there are electronic device issues. So these are three areas then that our PBIS and our MTSS systems can target so that there's reduction within those numbers. And then if you just want to keep going.
Please
we
do
also-
that. This is
go
a great
ahead.
example of why we have been focused on our attendance campaign. So we're using data to make decisions on why we are, again, incentivizing student attendance and trying to make sure schools are having discussions with students and families and finding out what the challenges are. It's why we move forward with efforts to improve our transportation options with students. It's because of data that exists that says we have an issue with the student attendance, and these are some of the things that we implement as strategies to improve things. So I'm only emphasizing that because we need to make sure that we're demonstrating to the board and the community that we are using data in an informed way to make our decisions.
Right. And we also know that this data is inaccurate, right? Because we see holes in that, because we have so many competing systems right now on how we're gathering data, that it influences how that data is represented. And in that example, although in EduClimber, we were able to pull out 3,900, majors that had been entered, we know that about 600 of them were cell phone violations that were being pulled over inaccurately. Right? So if you look at our discipline calibration, just in regards to our majors and minors, we know that a cell phone violation is not a major, but it was being represented in our data set as that. So we have things that we need to flush out that are human error in what that data warehouse does, and making sure that that information before we push it out is accurate. Did you have something you want to say? Okay, the other piece that we want to focus on is what are our behavior responses. One of the things that we're talking with principals about right now is that notifying the parent is a completely appropriate, right, response, but we would rather be focusing on that restorative intervention in regards to what's being taught, like how do we repair if there is damage first, and then making sure that sequence is organized around learning, not just punitive or, getting kids into trouble, right? So you can keep going. And this is just another example of how we use our data. We can now look at what time trends are. We know that most of our incidents are happening over the lunch period. What's happening over the lunch period, right? Unstructured time. So we're just, once again, using this information to drive how we're being responsive through our MTSS and PBIS lens. And you can keep going if you want. And then we're in the final stretch. So one of the things, just before we end, we just want to continually push that we are focused on district cohorts and coaches for coordinators, that we're getting into buildings, helping staff develop. Through the AWARE grant, we continue to focus on appropriate staff development, whether there's a whole range of staff development that we're doing, but making sure that staff have the right skills in the toolbox. That we are exploring MA billing, so that will be a new thing that's funded through the AWARE grant, or that we're exploring through the AWARE grant, and at a state level is how are we billing for special education, social work services, and that we're continuing to focus on those unstructured times. So buses, lunches, outside, making sure that all staff have access to high quality training. So anything else, sir? Any questions? I feel like we went over a little bit as far as time, but if
Member
there's any
Williams?
questions or comments?
I have lots of questions. Well, a couple questions. And maybe I'm supposed to know the answer to these, so I apologize if I am. And it might be a question for you, but as far as OSS, how and by whom is that determined? Is that a school handbook thing? Is it a district policy thing? Is it a case-by-case basis? How is OSS determined and by whom?
Out-of-school suspensions, we have a student handbook that
So it's different for
details
each
information.
school?
No, the student handbook,
Oh, student handbook,
yeah,
sorry.
the student
Thank you.
handbook is used by our school principals, who
Okay.
ultimately make the decisions on whether suspension is meted out or not.
So OSS, if OSS is deemed necessary, it's a black and white thing, like this determines you get out of school suspension.
The handbook gives guidelines, and ultimately the principal and the team, upon doing their investigation or the nature of the incident, will make a decision if an out-of-school suspension is warranted and the level or the number of days a suspension is needed.
Okay.
So an offense may lead to a 1-day suspension, 2-day suspension, or 5-day suspension, depending on the severity, based on the administrator's judgment and fact-finding.
Okay, thank you. And then can you explain a little bit or give an example of what a restorative intervention looks like?
Sure, I think like the primary example is between students, that there is a restorative interaction that's facilitated by an adult. Typically, that will look like a harm repair circle, or like where we bring those conflictual children into that same space, and we're able to take on like perspectives. We're able to make those amends, and then we're able to acquire and teach new skills on how to prevent that from escalating further the next time. That's a very novice, you know what I mean, way to look at that. But one of the things that we've done is to train. I think we've trained like almost 200 Duluth school staff on what restorative circles are, and then how to do those harm repair circles.
So that is peer-to-peer. What if it's student-teacher? Is that a different, would you respond differently?
I would say no. You know, I think that the integrity of the interaction is really what matters, but also making sure that there is an opportunity and both people are ready to enter into that repair, so that we're not traumatizing or, you know what I mean, stress or whatever that may be. But I do think that's an interesting question, and I think we continue to flush that out as far as our skill set and how we're developing the capacity, you know, of our staff. Yeah, does that answer your question? Perfect. And I want to go back to the OSS just for 1 second, but that also, like, one of the things that we're focusing on is what are our alternatives to suspension, right? So it's not just a one size fits all, right? There's a lot of nuance in there. And what we want to do is continue to find research on what best practice is so that we have an arsenal of other things that we can do besides just getting kids out of school, right?
Kind of the basis of that question, so
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear
Yeah,
you say that.
and one of the things that we're exploring our SEL curriculum, you know what I mean? We're exploring restorative practices, like there's a lot of things, but the focus will always be on community, right? How do we keep kids in community? Because that's where they learn best, right? Disconnection strategies only lead to further disconnection. So we are limited by how creative we can be, right? And I think that the more that we focus on connection as the mechanism to prevention, the better that we're going to be and set ourselves up for the future.
Member Larford Kemp, and then Member Meixel.
Thank you. Thank you, Todd and Tim. This is, you mentioned, Todd, that this is a lot of work and it takes a lot of time. And I know from, this kind of started when I got on the board, when we started moving towards this. And so having just numerous presentations over the years, I just really, I'm grateful for all of the time and commitment that people like you and our staff have had to making this happen, because these kinds of changes don't happen overnight. They take time. So I appreciate that. Can you share with people a little bit more about the kind of training that happens with our staff and to become that PBS school? That might be helpful for people. Just briefly.
So as far as cohort training, the regional trainers within Minnesota usually provide a training for a group of leaders in the school, and that includes principals, lead teachers, support staff, and they usually talk about the core components of PBIS as a school-wide practice. So those would be like, what are your expectations? How do you reinforce those? How do you acknowledge them? How do you teach them? And do you have a consistent structure across multiple settings, multiple environments within a school? And really, it comes to the team's generation of their ideas in their school to what that looks like, whether it's they design it around ROAR, whether they design it around SOAR, or the 3 Bs, be respectful, be responsible, be ready. I think that's another one. And that's their basis for how they implement. And then they onboard new staff, and then they train other staff in the building that may not have access to formal training. I know that some do have like a 2-page, here's what you need to know when other staff are in the building. And there's other strategies, of course, that they pick that allow other people to access it. A lot of artifacts that they collect as far as what they work on from teams, because they meet regularly every year, so.
And I would add, we're at this point as a district too, where we're focused on tier 1 implementation across the board, but we also know that it's not a one-size-fits-all problem, right? Like Homecroft has different problems than Denfeld, right? There's all of those nuances that we're really trying to take into account to make sure that the program that's implemented in that building is representative of the students and the families that are having that experience, in that building. As far as setting the baseline, as a district, like I have a list of things that we've accomplished. PBIS Resource Hub, you know what I mean? That all like information is being shared between building. There's been second step in regards to having social emotional learning, like what goes into having curriculum? What does it mean to go into the classroom and teach these skills? We've updated our code of conduct, our family and student handbook. We've purchased SEL curriculum for our high schools. We've added co-located therapists, and increased our MOUs so that we have Fond du Lac and culturally representative, mental health services in our buildings. We've developed a community partnership protocol. We've developed gender inclusion policy and resource hub, and I could go on, but like that is the work, and I think that is what I get excited about. But I also know that we're still trucking, and we're still moving in that direction, and that takes time and people. So I'm proud of what we've accomplished, but there's still a ton to do, and I know that we're getting as far as time. So,
Member Mikesell, and then Representative Dean.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here tonight. I know I get to see PBIS in action at Orting East, where my son's in, as a student, and it's where I'm on the PTA, and we do a lot of support for their programs there, and so they're doing such good work, and I just want to raise them up for that. I have 3 questions. So one, the AWARE grant that you've mentioned a few times. How long does that last? What exactly does it fund? And what happens when that grant is over?
So right now, the AWARE grant will run through this year and then next year. So what is that? 25-26 will be our last school year where the AWARE grant, it funds positions. So currently it funds 2 positions, 2 full-time positions, which are mine as the coordinator and then an interventionist who is able to work within the schools to develop those MTSS coordinators, which were referendum funded, to make sure that they're supported in their work. Within that, I mean, are you looking for kind of dollars or?
I'm just wondering, when the grant runs out, are we done with PBIS?
So it'll be 25. So that's the trick, is that we're good through 25-26 school year, but we're trying to leave breadcrumbs and a foundation that will last much further longer than that. We're trying to create district-wide hubs, access points where schools can contribute good ideas and continue to feed, off of each other, as well as those teaming structures of meeting biweekly with MTSS coordinators. So there's that interconnected framework, right, of support that is in the school district, not continually coming from outside of it.
So, and I'll jump in. The answer is PBIS will continue, even if the funding is not through the grant, because it is, again, it's one of our foundational supports for how we enhance the learning environment in our schools. We know we're going to have to make budgetary decisions about those, positions and the need for them. But that's why we are really spending a lot of the grant dollars now to build capacity of our staff so they can continue the work. But that doesn't mean that we won't have to find some additional resources to continue that coordination of efforts.
Okay, thank you. Last question then. So you say that we're an example for the state. People come and see the work that we're doing here. We know that on page 8, the why we do the work, about the research that has shown how it's improving social and self-awareness, decision-making capacity, improving academic outcomes, increased student engagement, et cetera, fewer disciplinary actions. So in the data, in the presentation that you have here for us today, we're seeing a dramatic decrease in our out-of-school suspensions, which is incredible. And if that has, something to do with PBIS, that's like applauding that. We're seeing that our survey data is showing increased approval, satisfaction, sure. But I'm not necessarily seeing other outcomes that the research has supported. Is that just because we haven't yet gotten our data system like up and running in order to capture some of those things? Or is it out there?
I think some of it is, this is my first time presenting. So just knowing what you want to know more about, you know, and if those are the data points that you want to be interested in, we can dig further in that. I think the other side is that we're just scratching the surface on EduClimber and like what that does to organize our information. So I think that we can start to dig a little bit deeper. And this was meant to be more of an introduction and peripheral of the things that we're doing and what we're seeing so far. But we can always dig deeper, and I appreciate that question.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much.
Representative Dean?
Okay, so I'm sorry if I'm misinterpreting anything you've said, but it sounds like the climate surveys that get sent out, do they, like, to what extent do they inform the work that you're doing with that?
Well, as an outcome tool, they inform people's views on how things are being done. So if things are safe in a school, for example, and everyone agrees with that in the fall, but maybe less so in the spring, the question is, okay, why is that? When we start to problem solve and we try and come up with solutions, look at other data sources, and then set up an action to see if we can improve it the following year or throughout the year.
Okay.
And I would say too, there's several categories, you know, that we look at, and each of those categories could be a target area that we would use to inform what we're going to do to be responsive to that. So if a student is saying, I don't like, if 50% of the students at Denfeld say they don't like being at school, we would want to explore that even further.
And I guess I just brought that up because I feel like at least at East, where I go, people don't put a lot into answering those surveys. And I'm sure that that's something you've had a hard time with in the past, but like I can honestly say for me personally, I don't remember one response I've ever put on one of those surveys, and I care about stuff like this, but at least at East, I don't see those being, and I know those obviously aren't true. I was curious because I was wondering how much that's really informing you, because I don't know that they would necessarily, I don't think that students' responses would give the best reflection of their.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I can say to that, because as far as like survey data goes, we want to get a good sample. We want to get a large sample. And I know certain schools have fluctuated in terms of how much participation they've had. So it's both there's an approval here, there's a lower score here, but we're talking maybe 20 that participated in the survey. So it may not be reflective. Some of those things I did note on the table though, so you can see how many people participated in the survey, but that is not broken down, you know, by East, by Denfeld, but you know, if you break it down by school, you do see a lot of difference. And it could certainly do that drill down if you want East to share with you, because I've looked at East along with the rest of the schools, but.
I think you bring up an excellent point, though, too, in regards to what are we doing to help students have better access, you know what I mean, to have a voice. And if you're interested or you have friends that are interested and want to give us feedback on how to get a better sample and more people involved, we would be more than willing to listen to that.
And I think that that kind of thing is really important. Like, so I run Student Forum at East where I ask them questions and I compile reports for this. And I think that those kinds of in-person discussions are always so much better than any online survey. We get so many Google Forms in our emails, and none of them get a lot of attention.
So one of the things too that we've been focusing on is potentially switching up the format that we're using. So rather than just a 1 through 5, you know, whatever that is, but there's actually a feedback survey. So we sit and listen, you know what I mean? And there's write-ins. Whether or not we have focus groups, there's a ton of different ways, you know what I mean? I think that we could gather and capture information. And I think that having students have a voice is incredibly important. So I appreciate that you bring it up.
I know that there's another question, but on this point related to student input, really appreciate the question, and I think this just exemplifies why student leadership is so important, and I'm so grateful for both of you to be here tonight. And I also wanted to say that we have intention, as I've mentioned to the board before, about creating an opportunity for a superintendent advisory council, student advisory council, so that we have multiple voices and because it's hard to be the one and only voice, right? Like you said, the discussions is where things matter, and that could be potentially an opportunity for a forum or opportunity for us to ask deeper questions to, because you're right, sometimes a survey is just like check, 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 and we want to make sure that we're truly hearing you, not just saying we listened.
Yeah, and that's very insightful, and he beat me to it. And so I'll just add that you're spot on, and we do realize that sometimes when we get data responses from our students and families that we see differences across the community on who responds and who doesn't. And sometimes we believe there might be survey fatigue out there. And then when it comes to students, we're trying to become real strategic in when we give out the surveys and how we give them, or if it's done during there's no more homerooms, but if it's done during a class period or if it's done during when. So we're trying to become really strategic on when schools give those surveys. But so thank you for that information, because we do see a difference in responses. So let me go to, I believe it's Member Lawfold and then Member Lafleur-Kemp.
And so, Representative Dean, thank you. You actually took that, I also say, are we getting strong returns and not just our student surveys, but in staff and in families? And you don't even have to respond. We know the struggle. We just shared why that happens. It happens with students. It happens in all areas. Could it be, but it is so important. I know that there's better ways, especially, if you try to focus on students, we have some captured audiences. They do go to school most days. I've spent, the last 7 years on the board, and we've had many evening gatherings where we're asking for community input. We've had surveys where we look and we don't, we have 3 or 4 that attend community service events that we have for their feedback. So it is frustrating, and we hope that people will watch this. Because one of the things I think sometimes our community thinks, especially when they see that there's behavioral issues, not just in Duluth, but across our country, this is the way that we want to address student behavior. It's not punitive. It is focused on positive behavior supports, teaching them. And if our public doesn't quite get that, because I think I've heard many times, why don't we just suspend them? Why are they even in school? And as a former educator and a parent, I want to say, that isn't going to teach them the skills they need to teach. And alternatives to suspension, I see it at Denfeld almost every day that I'm there. And it really is an avenue of success. And it's a way to, alleviate. When you send them home, that's not a great place for them to spend that time. So I applaud the district for using resources to do not only PBIS, but alternatives to suspension programs and a real concentration. But what's lagging is that the perceptions that we happen. And when we do have disruption in our school buildings with our students, some will say, well, yeah, we just need to kick them out or to suspend them. And that isn't educating students every day, all day, every student. So I've kind of taken a little leap there, but EduClimber, we hear it when we're in our student or in our teacher quality steering committee. It sounds like a great program or application, I don't know, but I think we're still working out some kinks in loading that up or how teachers access it. So I'll give you, keep working on that. It seems like it's going to work. And then I just wondered if new teachers that are at the colleges in their education programming are introduced to the concepts of PBIS and MTSS. Are they? It would help us.
I think that we're getting better at it. One of the things, I am also an adjunct professor at the College of St. Scholastica, but one of the things that I'm seeing more of is that these conversations are happening at the college level, and I think that that's encouraging. But I think that's for us, like where we're starting to plan out our professional development days, that in August, we're front loading these conversations. It's out of the gate. It's not in February, March, April. We make our gains early. And I think that as we work better with Anne Marie and how we start to plan out those professional development days, I think that you're absolutely right in how that looks, and just exposing more people to that language and that way of thinking.
Member Larfa Kemp?
Yeah, two things. So one is, it's been mentioned a little bit about how families do the surveys. And I know one year, they used kind of school conferences to do surveys. And I happened to be tabling, I can't remember even why we were tabling, at a few schools, and it seemed like that was one way that seemed to be successful. Is that kind of continuing one of the ways that you're reaching families?
Yeah, there's a variety of different opportunities a lot of schools use, whether it's a family night, conference night, whether it's utilizing a raffle or something to get people to participate more. But that is one of the good strategies that tends to get a good sample.
And one of the problems with that is that the sampling happens very close together because conferences for elementary are like in the middle of October and then again in the middle of February, where we want to make sure that there's enough time that goes by that we can demonstrate growth. So those are things that we're working out right now.
Yeah, because the survey, it's given 45 days beginning of the year and 45 days at the end of the year, according to the manual. So you have enough time between samples for any action steps you may want to take. But not everything in the schedule aligns with that survey, so
Right.
got to be creative sometimes.
Okay, thank you, John. And just the last piece of it was the professional development. And you mentioned, I think in the presentation, that you do a lot of onboarding. So that's onboarding with our new staff through professional development. How about our substitute teachers and our staff like that?
There's work to be done. You know, I think that there's holes across the board, and I think that the more that we're aware of it, the more that we can plan for what that looks like in the future. But there definitely are holes, and we need to acknowledge them.
Yeah, durability and sustainability is kind of the next step, because now we're implementing, but for new staff to come in, for subs that come in, we're going to need to strategize a little more.
It's a process. Thank you.
Member Derek Eater?
This
Chair
is-
Derek Eater?
Chair, right? Yes, dang it. You will respect my authority. No, just kidding. This is more of a comment, but on Friday I was at Piedmont Elementary. They had an assembly, and they're sort of like PBIS's work, respect, belong, and they give little certificates and everything. And all the kids were coming into the gym, and my parents are just sitting there and they're just kind of in awe because everybody's in line. It's loud. The principal holds up the zero. All the kids quiet. They sit down. They're respectful. They cheer for one another. And my parents were like, how does this happen? And I was like, well, that's PBIS. That's Tier 1 supports. That's expectations. That's everybody understands that we're in this community. This is how we act and this is how we respond. And they were still rambunctious and fun and all the things, but it was pretty incredible to just see when you have those strong Tier 1s and the PBIS, how incredible it can make those experiences for kids and teachers and everybody, so.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the earlier that we were doing those things, you know what I mean? Like elementary schools is perfect, you know, for exactly what that intervention is. And the other part that I go back to a lot is that the best prevention is connection, right? When we are in community, that prevents, you know what I mean, things in the future. So I think that that is the overarching goal of all of this, how we use the climate survey, why we do PBIS, why we're looking at MTSS, all of those things, so.
Thank you. I don't see any additional lights on. So I do just want to emphasize what Member Lolfo was sharing, is that even though you'll see and others, where you see a decrease in our overall suspension rates, we do still suspend, but you see definitely a decline, and that's a good thing, because we are really spending our efforts on, you know, positive behavior reinforcement, teaching of strategies, addressing behaviors in different ways, whether it's in-school suspension or alternatives to suspension. So we want to make sure that the community and our staff, I know sometimes brings up questions too, is why are we not suspending those students, or why can't we just get, send them home? But we are really trying our very best to keep kids in school, but also to address their behaviors in different ways, to teach those students appropriate behaviors to make sure we do remove them from those settings and put them in alternative to suspension opportunities, but we still have them in school, learning and growing, because that's what we're striving to do, is trying to keep our kids with us in community, with us in school. So thank you for everything you're doing, gentlemen, and your team. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Next up, Chair Derek Eater, we have one additional presentation. I have Executive Director Zunich and Executive Director Severance coming to the table. They're going to provide a budget update. So I'll just turn it over to both of them.
Good evening. We just didn't want to interrupt each other. We're just going to bring tonight an update on where we are at with our budget reduction timeline. That's what Executive Director Severance will be doing. And it's going to be short, but we're open to any questions.
So as we discussed, I think last month, we are moving forward with displacements, and that process did happen through last week. Communications were had with the employees that would be affected, and then letters were sent out on Friday to all of those affected employees. We do have a session tomorrow at the DFT for the teaching staff that were affected, just a Q&A, drop in, and we'll answer any questions that they can from 3 to 5. So if they have questions, we've also reached out. If they can't make that, certainly call HR or the DFT president, all willing to help answer the questions. There were a number that were not teachers, and so I'm working with the paraprofessional union to have conversations with their staff as well. And then we did have other non-certified staff that actually were laid off or given layoff notices. Of course, these don't go into effect till the end of June. So there may be some internal changes there where they can also secure other positions before that time frame comes. We do have a second round based on registration for the secondaries. Once that closes, we will have a second round potentially, depending on what that gives us for results for what classes need to be on, what are going to be offered for the secondary schools, and that will take place mid-March.
Member Lofold?
Does that mean a second round of potential letters of displacement?
Yes.
Okay.
Superintendent Magus?
Sure. And just to point out for the public, and I know we've talked about it at the board table quite a bit, but the difference between displacement and layoff, that displacement means that you're separated from your current position with the district, but you're still employed by the district. And layoff, if it should come to layoff, that would occur in the late spring, early summer, just because that's when we would know what is our final result with our budget and where are we with state aid and enrollment and several other things. So it's something that we look at very closely. I would also say that because people have been informed over the course of the past week, that some of the things that we've talked about as far as what areas might be reduced, that those are more public now. So you might have people advocating about for or against certain things. And so we encourage you to have that individuals let us know if they have concerns, but also if you have concerns or questions, feel free to reach out at any time, and we're glad to answer any questions related to some of the changes that are in effect.
Chair Derek Eater?
Could you just remind me again, when was the final notice or the due date for staff to let us know when their retirements?
The date was February 1st.
February 1st, okay.
And I believe the last number of folks that will be going at the end of the year, so we have some that have already happened, of course, I'm not including those, were 12, which is a lot less than we typically have in any given year since I've been here.
There are different calendars that have different dates besides February 1st, but the certified teachers are February 1st. So administrators and others are on a different timeline, but we keep track of all of that as well.
Member Banks and then Member Lofold.
Thank you. So you say displacement. So when folks are displaced, are they eligible for unemployment insurance?
So the
benefits.
displacement just means that at the end of this school year, if they haven't secured a position, then we have to do something else with them. So it depends, and I hate to use that as an example or as the answer. But if they are a tenured teacher, then we are obligated to find them a position or lay them off, which Superintendent Magus mentioned would happen in that time frame of kind of late spring, early summer. If they are a non-tenured teacher, they would be likely non-renewed. I'm not sure if that is unemployment eligible or not, but if they are laid off, they absolutely would be able to go through that process. All of the folks that wouldn't have a position for next school year would be eligible, but they are paid through the summer, so that is one thing too. So it really is more dependent on what happens at the beginning of the school year than it is in the spring.
So fair to say that right now, we don't have any layoff, they're all displaced until late spring or early summer?
There were 4 layoffs because their contracts are not in they don't have displacements in their contracts. So there were 4 that were given layoff notices for the end of June.
Sorry, my light is still on, but the question that popped into my head as you asked is, or comment rather, is that we are still making sure that everybody has been informed, but there are a couple of different layers that we have, like we mentioned with the registration process and some other things. So some people have asked, can we have a list of all the layoffs or displacements, and can we know the bigger picture? And we want to make sure that we share that information when we're able to, but we also want to be thoughtful about individuals and individual circumstances rather than have things shared publicly before people can be well informed and have opportunities like we have tomorrow to have questions answered. We're really trying to make sure that there are those safety nets for our staff. We care about them, and we want to make sure that we have answers for them related to some of the questions that they may have.
Chair, I don't see additional questions or light. That concludes our COW agenda for this evening.
Thank you. We are adjourned.
Thank you.